Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tales of the Darkness. Lower the lights and stay where you are. If something in your house feels slightly off, don't check it yet. Just listen. Story 1. The Calls That Used My Voice. My name is Michael, and I need to say this plainly before anything else, because the worst part was never the sound itself, it was how quickly it stopped feeling unfamiliar. It started with calls that ended the moment I answered, not silence, not static, just a clean disconnect, like the only goal was to confirm I was there and paying attention, and at first I blamed it on normal problems because normal problems are comforting even when they're annoying. I stopped answering unknown numbers, and the pattern adjusted like it had been waiting for that exact decision because the calls didn't stop. They shifted to different moments, different devices, different gaps in my day, always when I was alone enough that my mind could hear itself. Sometimes the phone would ring once and stop, and when I checked there would be nothing. No missed call, no notification, no record. And what stayed with me wasn't the lack of proof. It was the feeling that something had been close enough to touch the surface of my routine and leave without leaving footprints. I told myself it was stress, until the first time I heard breathing on the line, and I didn't hear it begin. I only noticed it after it had already matched my pace. Slow, measured, patient, like whoever was there had been listening long enough to learn how fast I calmed down when I wanted to pretend I wasn't scared. I didn't speak, and it didn't speak either, and the call ended with the same clean disconnect as before, like it had already collected what it wanted, and that should have been the end, but instead it became a lesson, because after that my body started reacting to silence the way it used to react to sound. The calls never came when I was fully occupied. They never came when I was actively thinking about them. They came when routine took over, when I was walking from one room to another, when I was washing my hands, when I was about to fall asleep, when my mind loosened its grip on the world and stopped guarding itself. I started keeping noise on all the time to avoid the gaps, but it didn't interrupt noise. It waited for the thin spaces between. It waited for the pause in a song, the moment a video buffered, the second the air conditioner stopped, and the room took a breath, and that was when the call would come and end, before I could answer, like it wasn't calling to speak. It was calling to place something in the quiet. After a while, it stopped using numbers entirely, and that's when it got worse, because the sound started arriving without the ritual of a ring. Sometimes the screen would wake on its own. Sometimes the speaker would click softly like a line had opened, and the breathing would already be there, waiting like it had been connected for a while, and I was the one who was late. I started recording it, trying to catch proof for myself, but recordings never helped because what made it frightening wasn't volume or clarity. It was timing, and timing is something you feel more than you hear, and when I replayed it back, it sounded almost normal, like a person on a bad connection, and that normality felt like an insult. The first time it spoke, I didn't recognize the voice as mine until later when I replayed the memory and compared it to how I sound in my head, and that comparison shook me because it wasn't a perfect imitation. It wasn't theatrical, it was practical, like someone had taken my voice and flattened it just enough to remove emotion but keep recognition. It said my name once, and then it paused, and that pause wasn't empty. It was shaped. It felt like it was waiting for something specific, not a reply, not a scream, just a shift in my breathing. And when I didn't give it anything, the call ended cleanly, and I sat there staring at a silent screen, feeling like I had failed a test I never agreed to take. After that, I stopped replaying anything. I stopped trying to prove it to myself and focused on what it was doing, because if it wanted my attention, then attention was the one thing I could control. I began noticing that it wasn't random. It had preferences. It liked transitional spaces. It liked moments of partial awareness. It liked the second after you close a door. And before you start moving again, it liked the point where your mind stops narrating what you're doing and slips into habit. It also liked isolation, but not the obvious kind. It didn't care if people were nearby as long as they weren't watching me, as long as my presence was unconfirmed by anyone else, because that's when you start feeling like your life is only % real in your own head, and that is a dangerous place to be when something is practicing how to sound like you. The voice returned more often after that, but not always. As my name, sometimes it returned as a phrase I only ever said internally when I was trying to focus a small private sentence that belonged to my thoughts, and hearing it out loud made my hands go cold, because it meant it wasn't copying me from the outside, it was learning me from the inside. And the difference between those two things is the difference between being followed and being accessed. I tried to change my routine. Then I changed how I spoke, how I moved, how I answered people. I forced myself to pause before responding. I altered my habits the way you might alter a password. And for a few days the calls slowed down, and I felt relief, until I realized relief was the goal, because relief makes you careless. When the calls returned, they were cleaner, better timed, and the voice sounded closer to the version of me I was trying to become, which meant it wasn't just imitating my old habits, it was tracking my adjustments and learning in real time. That was when I understood something that I still don't like admitting, which is that it wasn't stalking me to frighten me. It was using me as a tuning fork, and every reaction I had made it sharper. I stopped answering anything for a while. I let calls ring and end. I left devices in other rooms. I avoided being alone with silence, and still the pattern stayed, because the calls had never been the source, they had been a training mechanism. And the real effect was what it did to my attention. It taught me to listen for gaps, and once you learn that you can't unlearn it, because your mind starts scanning for absence the way it used to scan for danger, and absence is everywhere if you're patient enough to notice it. People began mentioning things casually that made my stomach drop, not dramatic accusations, just small misunderstandings. Someone asking why I called them late at night when I hadn't, someone responding to a message I never sent someone, laughing at something they thought I said from another room when I had been standing in front of them silent. At first I tried to correct them, and every correction made me sound defensive and unstable, so I stopped correcting and started observing, and what I noticed was always the same. They described the voice as mine, but careful, like it was trying not to get caught in a mistake, like it was learning where my tone rises, where it falls, and how long my pauses last. It started using my voice in places where it mattered socially, where a single sentence could create a misunderstanding that would isolate me without anyone needing to accuse me of anything. And that isolation felt intentional, because once you become the person who denies what people heard, you become the person no one fully trusts, and trust is the only thing that makes a room feel safe. I tried to tell one person I trusted, and the moment I began explaining it, I heard a soft click from my device like a line opening, and I stopped mid-sentence because it felt like the act of describing it had alerted it, and the person I was speaking to watched my face change, and I saw that look people give when they decide you are carrying something they don't want to touch. After that, I kept it to myself, and keeping it to myself made it stronger, because silence was the environment it worked best in, and I was giving it more silence every day. It began showing up not only as sound, but as expectation. I would wake up before an alarm with the feeling that something had already happened and I had missed it, and I would check my phone and see nothing and still feel the residue of a conversation that had taken place without me. Sometimes I would find myself holding my phone without remembering picking it up, and the screen would be lit like a call had just ended, and there would be no record, and my heart would already be racing, like my body had listened, even if my mind had not. That was when I started thinking about the possibility that it wasn't always contacting me from the outside. Maybe it was opening the line first and keeping it open quietly, and I was only noticing when my awareness brushed against it like touching a web in the dark. The scariest moment wasn't loud and it wasn't sudden, it was intimate and simple. I was alone, and I heard my own voice speak nearby, not through a speaker, not through a wall, not through a device, just present in the room at the edge of my point. Hearing like someone standing just out of sight, saying nothing important, just a small acknowledgement of being there. I froze and waited for my brain to correct it the way brains correct impossible things, but my brain didn't correct it because the voice had been built carefully to fit into reality, and that was the point. I didn't answer, and it didn't repeat itself, and the lack of repetition felt like a message, because repetition is for practice and silence is for confidence. After that, it started taking more risks. Not by becoming louder, but by becoming more believable. It would use my voice in the most harmless ways, short confirmations, soft acknowledgments, a quiet, yeah, from another room, a simple okay behind a closed door. And the danger was that those words were exactly the words people don't question because they sound like daily life. I noticed it working on other people's reactions now, not just mine, because I would see someone respond to me when I hadn't spoken or look toward a doorway when they heard my voice from somewhere I wasn't, and I would watch their face shift into mild confusion and then smooth itself back into normal, because humans prefer normal even when normal is wrong. It learned that too, and once it learns what people prefer, it can hide inside preference for a long time. I tried to break the pattern by becoming unpredictable, staying with others, talking constantly, filling silence with noise. But it didn't need silence in the obvious way anymore. It only needed the moment after noise, when people exhale and stop paying attention, and that moment happens everywhere, no matter how loud you live. The calls began coming less often, but each one felt more precise, like a tool used only when necessary, and that change told me it had moved past training and into use, because training is frequent and messy and use is selective and clean. I started getting reports from people, not accusations, just questions. Why did you say this? Why did you ask that? Why did you sound upset last night? And each time I denied it, the denial made me weaker, because the more you deny, the more people remember the sound, and the more they remember the sound, the more real it becomes in their minds, and reality is built out of what people agree they heard. I realized then that the thing wasn't trying to scare me out of my home, it was trying to make my identity unreliable, because once your voice stops belonging to you, you stop belonging to yourself, and that is a kind of isolation that doesn't require walls. I stopped using devices for a while, and the voice still found ways to arrive because it didn't need electronics to exist, it used them like a doorway. But the real doorway was recognition, and recognition happens in the brain, not in the phone. That's why the most dangerous moments were the smallest ones. A quiet house, a half-open door, a hallway with no one in it, a pause between words, when someone expects you to answer, and your answer arrives from somewhere else. I don't know what it is, and I don't want to know because naming things makes them easier to imagine and imagination gives them space, and this thing does not need more space than it already has. What I do know is that it learns faster when you react, and it improves when you deny, and it becomes confident when you stop talking about it, because silence is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of listening. If you take anything from this story, let it be this one simple warning that sounds obvious until you live it, which is that your voice is not just a sound. It is a pattern, and patterns can be copied, and once something copies you well enough, it doesn't need to follow you closely anymore, because it can move ahead of you and arrive first. And when it calls from the dark, it isn't trying to reach you to speak. It is trying to reach you to be heard, because being heard is how it becomes real, and once it becomes real, it doesn't need permission to stay. It only needs you to notice it and keep listening even when you swear you won't. Story 2. They didn't call it a sect. This story was shared with me by someone who asked not to be named and not to be followed up because some experiences don't need answers, they just need distance. My name is Daniel, and when I think back to the moment everything started, I realize now there was no warning, no sign, no dramatic change, just a slow shift in how people around me spoke and listened. It began with conversations that felt longer than they should have been, not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. Like pauses had more weight than words, and eye contact lasted just a second too long. A group started forming quietly, nothing official, nothing announced, just people who kept ending up in the same places, talking about the same ideas, and agreeing a little too easily. They never called themselves anything, and that was important because names create distance, and distance makes things easier to leave. At first it felt harmless discussions about purpose, about order, about how modern life pulls people apart, and how structure brings clarity. And when you hear those things enough times, they start sounding like common sense. They spoke calmly, never raised their voices, never argued directly, and that made disagreement feel rude, like interrupting someone who was already being patient with you. What I didn't notice at first was how often the same phrases repeated, not word for word, but close enough that they felt rehearsed, like ideas that had been practiced before being shared. They never pressured anyone to stay. They just made leaving feel unnecessary, like why would you walk away from something that felt so composed? The meetings weren't scheduled, they just happened, and that unpredictability made them feel natural, like coincidence, instead of routine, and routine is where people start asking questions. Over time, I noticed small changes in myself, the way I repeated certain ideas without remembering where I first heard them, the way I defended the group even when no one was attacking it. They talked a lot about listening, about being present, about learning to hear what's already around you. And after a while, that language started to sink in deeper than I was comfortable admitting. The first time something felt wrong was when someone asked me to stay after everyone else had left, not in a dramatic way, just casually, like it was already assumed. We sat in silence longer than felt normal, and no one rushed to fill it, and that silence felt structured, like it was part of the conversation. When I finally spoke, the response I got didn't answer what I said, it redirected it gently, like my words had been absorbed and repurposed. That was when I realized they weren't listening to respond, they were listening to adjust. From then on, the group felt closer, not socially but spatially, like they were always just nearby, even when I wasn't with them. I would hear phrases from the meetings echoed in unrelated conversations, spoken by people who hadn't been there, using the same calm tone, the same measured pauses. At night, I started replaying conversations in my head, Not obsessively, but automatically, like my mind was organizing something without my permission. The ideas became simpler, and that simplicity was comforting because complexity is tiring, and tired people stop resisting. They never asked for anything directly, no money, no commitment, no action. They just framed the world in a way that made alternatives feel noisy and unfocused. I stopped talking about them with people outside the group, not because I was told to, but because explaining it felt difficult, like translating something that worked better, unexamined. The first real break came when I missed a meeting without telling anyone, and the next day multiple people reached out, not concerned, not angry, just checking in using almost identical language. That's when it hit me that absence was being noticed more than presence, and that scared me more than any demand would have. I tried to step back quietly the same way I had entered, but the conversations followed me, not physically, but verbally, phrases I had never repeated out loud, coming back to me through other people. It felt like the group had expanded beyond itself, like the ideas had detached and started circulating on their own. I began paying attention, then really listening, and what I noticed was that the calm tone never broke, even when conversations turned personal, even when someone expressed fear or doubt. The response stayed steady, measured, almost rehearsed. One night I asked a direct question about where the ideas came from, and the room went quiet, not tense, just focused, like I had finally said something worth addressing. The answer I got wasn't specific, it was framed like a reminder that origins don't matter as much as alignment, and that was when I felt something tighten in my chest. Because alignment sounds harmless until you realize it doesn't require understanding. After that, the atmosphere changed. Subtly, conversations shortened, eye contact lingered less, and I felt like I had stepped slightly out of sync with something that kept moving without me. But the worst part was realizing how easily I could still fall back into it just by listening long enough. After that conversation, I tried to pull back without making it obvious, because obvious movements attract attention, and attention felt like the one thing I couldn't afford. I stopped attending meetings, but I didn't announce it, and for a while, nothing happened, which almost convinced me that I had imagined the intensity of it all. But then I started noticing patterns, the same people crossing my path in places they had never been before, conversations starting mid-sentence, like they had already been going on without me. They never mentioned the group directly. They just spoke in that same calm, measured way, using the same language about focus, about clarity, about removing noise. I would hear my own thoughts repeated back to me by someone else, phrased slightly differently but close enough that my stomach tightened every time it happened. The worst part was how normal it all felt on the surface, because nothing they did crossed a clear line, and without a clear line, there's nothing to push against. One evening, someone I trusted asked if I had been listening properly lately, and the way they said it made it sound less like a question and more like an observation. I started avoiding familiar places, changing routines, walking longer routes home, not because I was afraid of being followed physically, but because I didn't want to hear those phrases again. Sleep became difficult because my mind kept replaying conversations, stripping them down to their structure instead of their meaning, and once I noticed that structure, I couldn't unhear it. It was always the same pattern: acknowledgement, reassurance, redirection, and then silence just long enough to let your thoughts rearrange themselves. I tested it once by repeating one of their phrases back to someone outside the group and watching their reaction, and the moment I said it, their posture changed slightly, like they recognized something without knowing why. That was when I understood it wasn't about belief, it was about familiarity. The ideas didn't need to be true, they just needed to feel settled. And once something feels settled, people stop questioning it. I finally broke contact, completely stopped responding, stopped engaging, stopped listening. And for a while, the pressure eased like something had stepped back to reassess. But even then, I noticed how easily the language came back to me in moments of stress, how my mind reached for that calm structure when things felt uncertain. That scared me more than anything else because it meant the group didn't need to exist anymore to keep working. It had already trained me. I don't know how many people were involved or how far it spread, and I don't want to know because knowing would give it shape, and shape gives things weight. What I do know is that some ideas don't need force. They don't need secrecy, they just need repetition and patience. And if you're listening to this and something about it feels familiar, pay attention to how calm it feels, because calm is often where resistance disappears. If this story stayed with you, make sure to subscribe to Tales of the Darkness, because what comes next doesn't announce itself and some things don't end when you stop listening. Story 3. The Children Who Learned to Stay Quiet. My name is Sarah, and I didn't notice anything wrong at first because nothing arrived. Suddenly, it arrived already knowing how to behave. The children were quiet, but not in the way tired children are quiet, not restless, not bored, just still, like they had learned that silence worked better than sound. At first, the adults joked about it, saying it was good discipline, good manners, good listening skills. And when you hear something framed like that enough times, you stop questioning why it feels uncomfortable. They didn't play loudly, they didn't run, they didn't interrupt conversations, and when they were spoken to, they responded immediately with the right tone and the right words, like they had practiced them before. What stood out wasn't what they did, it was what they never did. They never asked questions, and they never reacted late. When something happened, their eyes moved first, their bodies followed second, and their expressions changed last, like emotion had become a delayed response. I noticed it during a gathering when one of the children dropped something heavy, and instead of startling, they froze, completely waiting, and only moved again after an adult looked at them. No one told them to do that, they just knew, and that detail stayed with me longer than it should have. I asked one of the adults if they had been trained that way, and the answer came back calm and casual, saying, "Children adapt faster than we think," and that answer stayed with me because adaptation doesn't usually look that precise. The more time I spent around them, the clearer it became that they were listening even when nothing was being said. They watched doorways, corners, reflections in glass, and sometimes they turned their heads at the exact same moment, like they were responding to something shared. I tested it once by speaking softly behind them, and they didn't react until I finished the sentence. And when they did, they turned together like they had been waiting for a signal. They didn't seem scared, they seemed informed. At night, when the house was quiet, I could hear movement but never footsteps, just pressure, like someone shifting weight carefully across the floor, and every time I checked the rooms, the children were already back in their places, sitting, upright, eyes open. They told me they were just listening, and when I asked what they were listening for, the answer came too fast, not thought out, not imagined, just delivered. They said they were waiting for it to finish speaking, and that was the first time I felt cold. After that, I started paying closer attention to what the adults said around them and what they avoided saying, and there were gaps, entire topics that never came up, like they had been quietly removed. No one mentioned dreams, no one mentioned fear, and no one ever spoke about the sounds at night, even though everyone reacted to them. The children never spoke about it either, but sometimes, when they thought no one was watching, they would mouth words without sound, repeating something silently until they noticed me and stopped. When I asked one of them what they were saying, they told me it was easier not to make noise because noise made it pay attention, and I didn't ask what it was because I already knew that question wouldn't get answered. The adults weren't cruel, they weren't abusive, they were careful, and that made it worse because it meant whatever was happening had been accepted, not fought. One night, the power went out and the house went completely dark, and in that moment, I heard breathing, not panicked, not fast, just measured, coming from somewhere low and central. The children didn't move, they didn't cry, they didn't call out, they just sat still facing the same direction, and that was when I realized they weren't being protected. They were being prepared. After that night, I couldn't stop noticing how carefully everything was arranged, not clean, not organized, just placed like the house itself had learned where things should remain. The children moved through the space without bumping into anything even in the dark, and when one of them stood, the others adjusted slightly without looking like they were maintaining a balance I couldn't see. I tried speaking normally again, laughing, raising my voice once just to see what would happen, and the reaction was immediate. Not panic, not anger, just attention. Every child turned toward me at the same time, and the adults went quiet like someone had broken a rule without knowing it. No one corrected me, but the atmosphere tightened, and it stayed that way until the noise settled back down. Later, one of the adults told me calmly that loud sounds made things difficult, and the way they said it made it clear that difficulty wasn't for them. I asked how long the children had been taught to behave this way, and the answer came slowly, like it had been measured before being released, saying children learn faster when they don't question instructions. That explanation didn't sit right because what I was seeing wasn't obedience, it was anticipation. The children weren't waiting to be told what to do, they were waiting for something else to finish first. At night, I started hearing the same breathing again, always steady, always close to the floor. And when I followed the sound, it never led anywhere specific. It just stayed present like pressure without location. The children would sit facing it, eyes open, calm hands resting on their legs, and when the sound stopped, they relaxed slightly like a signal had been given. I asked one of them how they knew when it was done, and they told me it always ends the same way, with a pause long enough to feel safe. And that was when I realized the silence wasn't absence, it was a cue. The adults avoided my questions after that, not by refusing to answer but by redirecting them gently, the same way someone calms a child who asks about things they're not ready to understand. They spoke about routine, about stability, about how the children slept better now, how there were fewer incidents, fewer problems, fewer disruptions, and they never said fewer nightmares. One evening, I overheard a conversation between two adults speaking quietly about how the children used to cry at night, and how that had stopped once they learned to stay still, and the way they said learned made my stomach turn. I tried to leave after that, telling myself I was overreacting, but the moment I packed my bag, the children watched me closely, their eyes following every movement, and one of them spoke up asking if I was going to make noise outside. When I asked what they meant, they said it listens farther when people leave, and that stopped me. I stayed one more night, and that was a mistake. Sometime before morning, the house shifted, not loudly, not violently, just enough that I felt it, and every child sat up at the same time, without being told. The breathing returned closer than before, and I realized it wasn't moving through the house anymore. It was centered, and everything else was adjusting around it. No one screamed, No one ran, the children just waited, and the adults stood still like they had accepted that this was the safest response. When it ended, the silence felt heavier than before, like something had settled deeper. That morning, the children were quieter than ever, and one of them told me softly that it was proud of them. I asked who said that, and the answer came without hesitation, saying the quiet part did. I left shortly after that, and I didn't tell anyone where I had been because explaining it felt dangerous, like giving it another way to be heard. But even now, when rooms go quiet in a certain way, I feel my body slow down automatically, like part of me learned the same lesson. Because once you understand that silence can be used, you never hear it the same way again. Closing Tales of the Darkness. This concludes tonight's stories on Tales of the Darkness, and if you're still listening, it means the silence around you hasn't felt empty for a while, and that's usually when it starts. These stories don't end when the video does. They stay in familiar rooms, they repeat sounds you recognize, and they wait for moments when nothing seems to be happening. So tonight, pay attention to voices that answer too quickly, to pauses that feel intentional, and to quiet spaces that seem aware of you being there. If you want more stories like these, make sure to subscribe to Tales of the Darkness, because new stories arrive regularly and they don't need to be invited to stay. Good night.